as we've been talking about, flowers are basically modified branches. So let's just kind of look at that a little more closely and talk about the possible evolutionary trends in flowers, and also just what we see in plants. Flowering plants, we've been saying, are the higher level plants. Just having flowers at all, of course, is something that is having a structure that is attracting pollinators and allowing for fruits to form that would have seeds. Those are all considered higher level sorts of things. But even on some of the, like gymnosperms, for example, with pine cones, you can see this idea of modified branch where you would have this central axis with leaves, if you will, coming off of that branch, and those would be the parts of the cone. And in this case, this is just like a modification of that structure, or that is, a branch also, but with only 4 whorls. The whorls being the sepals, petals, stamens, and carpels, like we've been talking about. So some evolutionary trends, though. First of all, one of the trends is having flowers that have few to many parts. It kind of doesn't matter how many, but in an indefinite number, to having more definite structure to the flowers. In other words, fewer parts with definite numbers to it. That's sort of an evolutionary trend. The second one is having the 4 whorls spirally arranged, which basically I kind of drew here. I mean, it doesn't look spiral there, but you have a central axis and you have the things arranged off that axis. And but the trend in higher level plants is for that axis to shorten and or the floral parts to be fused. So in other words, all of these things would look like they were coming off at one point, which is kind of what we were showing with the epigynous and the perigynous sort of look to the flowers, the way that the flower part's inserted. Another trend is having a superior ovary or hypogynous to having the inferior one or epigynous. And then also radial symmetry or actinomorphic flowers, and then the trend is towards bilateral or zygomorphic, just more complex looking flowers that would have definite numbers of floral parts. All right, so one of the questions is, how does pollination, I think I misspelled pollination, it should be I-N-A. Anyway, how does pollination serve as an agent for evolution? And in particular, if you think about, let's say, for example, the whorls being spirally arranged, having them on a long axis, and you're thinking about animals that are pollinating them. So think of, a bee, and if it's pollinating, so what's going to happen if it comes to visit the nectaries in the, comes to visit nectaries? So a lot of times these nectaries are at the base of the petals or at the base of the stamens. And if it comes to visit the nectaries, it's going to get pollen on it, and the pollen is going to be from the stamen, right? But if it flies directly away and it's on a long axis like this, it's less likely to hit the carpel. Whereas, and even the next time it comes in, if a bee could come down to this part as opposed to avoiding that part. Now, you have to realize I have to get the pollen from this part to the carpel of this part, and not necessarily on the same flower, right? I'm going to go to the neighboring flower to do that. So I have to get the pollen on me, and then when I visit the next flower, I'm going to have to pass the carpel, right? So the more the floral parts are fused, in other words, the shorter this axis is, the more the stamens are sticking up and allowing me to collect pollen, but then I have to go down in past the carpel to get something. So I'm going to be collecting pollen from all the flowers I visit and always passing the carpel to get to the nectaries or to drink nectar from the flower, which is usually at the base of the petals, okay? The other thing is ovary superior versus inferior. Inferior would mean that this part is way down in, whoops, I erased it, way down in, and that would be also because the animals are visiting. So animals probably played a role in this sort of evolutionary trend towards making the stigma and style sort of below where the pollen is, so that the is more likely to get pollinated. Now, early pollinators or early pollination types are wind. All right, so wind is a common pollination type, and so like the plants that have a more separate have more separation in the whorls are wind pollinated. And as you get more and more complex and more towards this trend, these are more animal pollinated, meaning, you know, bees, butterflies, bats, hummingbirds, that kind of thing. All right. Now, flowers also are going to develop into fruit. So what happens is the ovary, generally speaking, the ovary wall is going to develop into a fleshy part of the, or at least a protective part around the ovule, which will then be, because of pollination, will be fertilized and become a seed. Okay, so the fruits then, the ovary wall that is changed, either fleshy or dry structure around the seed is called a fruit, and that is basically how the new little plant is going to get distributed. And a lot of times, like in early on, it could be distributed by just gravity or water. And if they're really small, like some of them might have be distributed by wind. And then the higher level plants are distributed by animals and need to go through the digestive tract and all of that kind of thing, like that we sort of alluded to in some of the other lectures. Okay, so in general, these trends are, you know, basically from the simple spread out and to the more complex type of flower. All right, so that's in flowers. If we looked at just kind of overall evolution of plants, we already kind of went over these groups, so but we might have called them slightly different. So these are the non-vascular plants, or the mosses that we talked about, the bryophytes early on in the semester. And pterophytes are ferns. So remember we talked about how pterophytes were the first ones on land. They reproduced by spores. And then as you go up in these levels, in these groups, you get seeded plants, ones that have cones and so forth, and then the angiosperms, which have flowers, okay? So you're going to have then, if we kind of look at the sort of things that happen along that evolution, you're going to have this is not something we talked about, so I'm going to kind of skip that a little bit. But basically, you might remember from the bryophytes or the mosses, they had a multicellular embryo inside of a structure, the archegonium, and the sperm was developed in the antheridium. Anyway, so that happened first as one of the evolutionary trends before any plants could go on land, because you had to protect the reproductive parts from drying out. But the next things were tracheids, which were the small tubes, and then as you got into even higher level plants, you had to have fatter tubes, and then you had to have seeds in order to go into the seeded types of plants.